we turn our attention to what might be called the libertarian left, or more popularly, anarchism.
This is the same logic shared by Marx and Freud.
Functioning libertarian socialist institutions, I think they are an interesting model that I think is highly relevant.
Hello.
Bonjour. Hola.
Do I also say hi? I'm also here.
Hello, Henry.
Hello. We do have a cold open, and it's the fact that this is the recording with the partner. It's been revealed, if you will. So Henry's also on the call. Hi, Henry.
Hello, everybody. Surprise.
The reason Paula moved to Cardiff.
Yeah, the reason I'm so far away from Hannah.
Yeah.
He took me away, guys. He kidnapped me. He history napped me? I don't know.
History napped.
I don't know. I'm trying to make it interesting.
Yeah, it's hard to cold open when we just talk all the time.
Yeah, because usually when it comes to cold open, we've never really met the guests before, so we can only talk about that subject. But for this one, I talk to Hannah almost every single day.
You obviously talk to Henry every single day.
How do you know that?
You just ignore him.
He will say yes.
I mean, there does reach a certain point in the evening where I'm sort of like auxiliary because Paula is sort of deep in TikTok, and I need sleep, so this so I sort of gently roll away.
You know what we can talk about? We can talk about Henry's bread consumption. How much bread do you eat, Henry? In a daily basis.
Oh no, have I been outed as like
the bread consumer?
I do like bread. There's currently nothing that remains of the focaccia loaf that Paola prepared on when was it? Sunday?
Yeah. I made an entire focaccia with like cheddar and jalapenos, so it's not like an easy bread to eat.
And yet Henry found a way.
It's Tuesday.
Paula's become a bakery solely to feed Henry's bread habit.
We have saved so much money ever since I brought to life my sourdough starter, Christine. Whenever I make a loaf, the loaf is now named Christina. If I make a pancake, she's Christy.
So this podcast is now taking a direction into the trad wife sort of lifestyle.
How dare you? Are you saying breaking bread is only for trad wives? That seems exclusionary.
You know who also baked bread?
Jesus.
I am turning 33 this year.
Why did I know that? That was what you were going to say. What does 33 have to do with anything?
That's when he was crucified.
Oh.
Guys, we'll find out in November. I think this is usable.
Yeah, this is fine.
I mean, between the bread consumption, we went to the Lake District. If listeners don't know, but I broke my elbow. Henry had to take me to the hospital.
I keep forgetting that happened because so much has happened.
So between Hannah's visits to the ER, or the A&E, and my one visit to A&E, so we waited like a month, and I was like, oh, like, I think my arm is fine and dandy. No, we were climbing. So I had just recovered from surgery. My arm was still technically broken. And I'm just like climbing up things, and Henry's just like having to like wait with me while I catch my breath, and I'm just like, I hate this.
In hindsight, I should have seen it coming because on the drive up, Paola turned to me and was like, "So what do they call it, the Lake District?" I'm not entirely sure Paola was fully prepared for what was
didn't
there.
Google it beforehand.
No. I was like, is there one large lake or is there many large lakes? I had questions.
Many.
They call it the Lake District, yet there are these hills everywhere.
Yes. I'm like, there's other lakes in this country. Mm-hmm. Why was this the Lake District? It's a legit question.
It is a legit question. One I can't answer because I don't know.
See?
As soon as I leave a place, I forget everything about it. Anyway, welcome to Theoryish. First of all, I don't know if we said that.
No, I don't think we did.
We always forget we're Theoryish.
Yeah. My name is Theory and you are the ish.
Yeah, exactly.
My name is
Theory,
Paola.
and I'm the ish.
I legally changed my name between this podcast and the last one.
My name is Dr. Ish.
That'd be sick.
It's like our friend Dr. Straw. No, well, I'm Paola Medina.
Oh, yeah. Hannah is.
And today we have a special guest. You want to introduce yourself?
Hello, I'm Henry Brown, lecturer in modern European history at Cardiff University. And I mostly look at anti-fascism, specifically in the Spanish Civil War. I have a lot of military history in my background, so I guess that's why I'm sort of talking about war today.
Well, you suggested Clausewitz to us. Originally, you were trying to make me read it in German, and at the time I was like, sure. And what a mistake that was.
Did you try?
No.
You were like, yeah, I'm not doing that.
Absolutely not. No, because it's like really old German. And yeah, I'm not doing that to myself. I'm in my 4th year of PhD. I'm tired. Also, this room is hot. I'm sweaty. I'm not reading German. No. But we did read like 3 different versions, I think.
Did we?
Yeah.
Because we read different translations.
As you probably gathered from everything that we were talking about, Heather and I lived together, and we noticed that our versions were very different when it came to explaining each chapter within book 1. And it was nice to have his version, because it was a little bit harder to read, but it made way more sense than the version that I read. How did you find it?
My translation is, it's an odd one. It's kind of the sentence construction is really elaborate. So like there'll be like multiple sort of dependent clauses. It's sort of, really hard to follow, to keep track of everything that he's sort of like conveying to you. So the result is you have to take it really, really slowly. So we looked at sort of 30 pages for this. And I had to reread it like multiple times just to get the gist. And I still don't think I quite understand certain like sections and passages. I don't know, Hannah, if you feel the same, but it's not a pleasurable read. I wouldn't necessarily recommend that our readers go out and get themselves a copy just for the hell of it. But yeah.
Yeah, Hannah, how did you find reading this?
It was one of those ones where, because I did not have time to like reread it, I just let it flow over me. I just caught what I could. And then the rest of it, I was like, I'll let Henry explain.
I finished reading it this morning before teaching, and my comprehension of it, I think, was greatly substantiated by our previous discussion, Henry. Because when I finished up those pages, I was like, I have no idea what I read. We'll figure it out. We'll figure it out together.
Yes.
So today we're doing On War on Clausewitz. So I think, Henry, take it away. Who is he? Why do we care?
Okay. Well, so Clausewitz is essentially, he's born in 18th century Prussia to a noble family. That's why he's Karl von Clausewitz. Von is designator of part of the Junker class. He's the youngest, I think, of 4 children, somewhere in that ballpark. He's the youngest son, and essentially the way that Prussia works at this point is, the older son will take care of the land, and the younger sons will sort of become civil servants, or very often they'll become officers in the army. So Karl joins the Prussian army. Now, the Prussian army at this point in sort of European military history is kind of, it's something, he joins in sort of the later 18th century when it's still it's the aftermath of Frederick the Great's sort of wars and reforms, and Frederick the Great sort of like the most vengeful twink of all time, sort of like transformed Prussia into this really sort of militarized state. Voltaire is supposed to have said that whereas most states possess an army, Prussia's army possesses a state. And again, it was a sort of a real source of pride and identity for Prussia, was that they had this sort of this really sort of disciplined army. But Clausewitz joins a bit after this, when it's sort of beginning to show signs of of being outdated and not keeping pace with the times. And with the outbreak of the French Revolution and the French Revolutionary Wars, Prussia very rapidly discovers that it is, and many other states are not prepared for these sort of new types of war where, like, we're talking about the sort of the employment of masses of men, the employment of nationalism as motivating factor. Clausewitz serves at the Battle of Jena-Auerstadt in 1806, and this is a battle that the Prussians sort of expect they're going to win because, again, we have this great military inheritance and such. The French defeat them very, very handily. About 25,000 Prussians are taken prisoner, and Clausewitz is one of them, and he basically learns an enduring hatred of the French from this point onwards, and becomes a sort of a convinced German nationalist. But he does, when he gets out of prison, he does marry Marie von Brühl. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but she's sort of his social superior kind of thing. She's, fiercely intelligent, sort of his intellectual equal, if not sort of superior. They enjoy socializing in sort of Berlin's like high society. And it's actually thanks to Marie that we have a lot of Clausewitz's work. She ends up, after his sort of premature death, editing it all together and making sure that On War gets published. Anyway, so after he gets out of prison, Prussia is forced to sign this sort of humiliating treaty with Napoleon, which basically obliges them to sort of go to war on Napoleon's side in future wars. In 1812, Napoleon invades Russia, and Clausewitz sort of punkily defects over to the Russian side and issues this declaration in which he says, "I'm putting my loyalty to the German nation above my loyalty to the German king." This becomes a bit of an issue for his military career because although he is by all accounts a very sort of able officer, because he's taken this decision to kind of defect, and sort of take his stand on the side of sort of nationalism rather than loyalty to the crown, it means that he's never sort of accepted by the sort of the court. After the war, he is shuffled off to the War College in Berlin, where he is sort of director for 15 years. And that's when he starts sort of writing very intensely about war and studying war in great detail and drawing together, sort of from 1816 onwards, he starts to draw together on war. A theory, if you will, a philosophical theory of what war is. Ultimately, as I mentioned, he's unable to sort of to bring it to fruition because in 1830, I believe, he's essentially called on to help sort of contain there's an outbreak of cholera in Poland, and he rushes off, leaving all of his papers behind to deal with this, and then almost immediately dies of cholera. So again, it's Marie, his wife, who has to sort of piece everything together. So there's actually an element of uncertainty as to how much of On War is the finished product. There's some suggestion that Clausewitz gave at some point that Book 1, Chapter 1, which is what we've read for today, is the most finished element of the book, but it's not quite clear. But yes, it's an interesting book because it's not immediately recognized on its release. It really gains traction in the second half of the 19th century when the German Imperial Army really starts sort of touting it as sort of, part of their ingredients for thrashing the French and mastering the art of war. But yes, it's had sort of variable interpretations.
Clausewitz is something that has been showing up a lot more for me, especially as I had finished my last chapter on military handbooks. He does show up a lot, specifically in World War I, World War II albums or handbooks. It's a very specific type of person that I think is reading Clausewitz.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, one of the things that there's this enduring quotation that I remember, which is essentially that military guys like to quote Clausewitz in the same way that communists do Marx or some Christians do with the Bible. It's sort of, it's to be quoted, but it's not to be understood. It's full of snappy things that you can throw out, but you don't necessarily understand the whole thing.
Yeah.
So,
and it's one of those pieces, I don't know about you, Hannah, but I found it really fascinating because it wasn't being specific about which war, but it was just of war, very well named. It is literally about war. And obviously, while certain parts of it felt quite antiquated, especially given that this is from the early 19th century, it was kind of surprising to see how much of it was still a bit relevant. And I don't know, when we were reading it together, we were breaking it down a lot, specifically the style of how it was written and how it was being representative, because it felt like, every single sentence had a point, which is also what's really annoying about reading On War, because if you misinterpret the previous sentence, you're not going to get the rest of it. How did you feel about it?
it's very specific. It's got a lot of intention, right? Which is what you're saying. Like, it's got very, like, every single sentence is made to make a point. But I never looked up any of the context because I was like, Henry's going to tell me. I have limited time. I'm applying for job. But without the context, at times it's quite, like, vague, like who's being referred to. So, like, one of the things I brought up to, like, we've got a question on our kind of structure about, like, who is the book for? But then there's another specific question I guess I had about, like, for example, he makes these very, written in the 1800s. He makes these statements about, like, civilized nations and savages. And I was like, who is being referred to? Who is he imagining as savages? Is it a more general statement? Is it more specific? Is this also an indication of who the book is aimed at? Do you know what I mean? And so, yeah. Anything Henry can reveal on that would be helpful. Or you, Paolo, since you both discussed it.
I mean, take it away, Henry.
Yeah, it's. I mean, obviously, it immediately goes to the issue of, like, he's writing in the early 19th century. He's also sort of virulent German nationalist. And one of the things that it's important to remember is that the 1812 proclamation that he gives when he defects to the Russian army is quoted a lot by Hitler, and Hitler actually names the defense of Berlin Operation Clausewitz. So it's very much like, he is a man who is, again, part of this kind of nationalist milieu, and very much sort of minded that of, very much steeped in sort of Eurocentric visions of the world. He's sort of, he sits between the kind of the Enlightenment and the romantic sort of views of war and indeed worldviews in general. And I think this sort of, the way that he talks about civilized nations as opposed to savage nations is very indicative of this kind of, this worldview that he has, because he talks about, if the wars of civilized people are less cruel and destructive than those of savages, the difference arises from the social condition both of the states in themselves and in their relations to each other. So essentially, he kind of, in a lot of passages, he's trying to make an assertion that, everything that I have to say about Europe. There may be universal principles, but beyond the civilized European world is the savage world, and that's a different ball game. And this sort of different ball game, when he's talking about it, he's very much talking about Asia. In this period, he regards the sort of the Asian kingdoms, the Asian powers, as being fundamentally driven by war and sort of governed by unrestrained passions and a total lack of reason. Again, horrifically sort of, racist Eurocentric sort of interpretations. Whereas he sort of argues that actually Europeans, we're less warlike. We've lost the kind of the Asiatic warlike vigor. The way we counteract the sort of the vigor and the martial sort of valor of Asiatic states like the Ottoman Empire or the Tartars or the Marathas is through the application of intelligence. So he argues that European warfare it's not less sort of destructive, and it's more discriminating in its use of violence, but it's no less destructive. And the reason for that is because Europeans, we have mastered the intelligence, and therefore we can apply violence in a much more sort of precise and efficient way. So yes, it's very clear the sort of assumptions that he's making, and I think actually this does bleed over into quite a lot of assumptions that are still sort of made in other areas of military history. The sort of the idea that fundamentally technology will make war sort of less cruel, less savage, more civilized, more precise. He doesn't say that war will be less violent. He says that the nature of war is violence. War is fundamentally about, like, compelling the enemy to fulfill your will through the application of violence. But he does seem to make the case that we Europeans are, have moved beyond the sort of the barbarism of non-European peoples, and we're sort of part of our sort of the way we conduct war is through sort of a precise application of force as opposed to an indiscriminate one.
I think that was basically where I was also falling with his interpretation of barbarism. But I was also thinking about this is also, early 1800s. So this is also having to deal with post-American Revolutionary War, and also dealing with the savagery of, or, quote unquote savagery of the French Revolution. And now in the wakes of, or the beginning rumblings of the Haitian Revolution. So I feel like he's also responding to how Europeans are now having to deal with this beginnings of international conflict. Because before it used to stick mostly to the continent, maybe over to Asia and Russia. But now it's you're crossing seas. Now you are losing colonial power. And, Germany didn't even exist. Germany wasn't even founded till 30 years after his death. So it is also, I think, a huge transition from what used to be the gentlemanly war, where they just went to a field and shot each other, to there having to be tactics. They have to look into guerrilla warfare and they have to think about, different climates. Fighting in the jungle is different than fighting in Spain. So I think it's also him having to deal with this post-Napoleonic type of situation, I guess. Yeah, because he fought in the Napoleon.
He fought exclusively in sort of the French Revolutionary and the Napoleonic Wars, and he draws most of his examples from sort of a combination of ancient history, European history, like a lot of the wars of Frederick the Great and the Napoleonic Wars. But I think you do raise a really interesting point when it comes to the question of like the transformation that's undergone. And as you say, this sort of the French Revolution has changed the way that warfare is being conducted, because the French Revolutionary armies are not just Enlightenment armies, or not wholly Enlightenment armies. They're also driven by sort of the passions, by emotions, by nationalism, and this is quite revelatory for Clausewitz, I think, because it tells him that sort of the European nations can equally be driven by the passions. They have to be tempered by reason, but he does sort of see that the passions are not purely the domain of non-European peoples, that actually the sort of the energies of the nation in arms, it's not a rational force. And then again, this is why he's really a man entering into the era of romanticism and sort of, the idea that fundamentally this enlightened view of everything being a sort of, orderly and reducible to a science is no longer tenable. Warfare from now on is going to be increasingly driven by passions, increasingly driven by sort of irrational forces, as much as it is going to be moderated by the more rational ones.
So I think there's something interesting here. So I have another question about specificity, but we'll leave that for a minute. Do we think then, if he's like moving, I guess, into this romanticism and all this kind of stuff, but in general, do we think he thinks war is inevitable? Or is he kind of like for war? Do you know what I mean? That sounds like a random question. But is he in support of war happening, or does he just think it's inevitable, or is it a kind of bit of both, right? As a military person.
Yeah, I think it's a bit of both. I mean, he has this sort of, he regards war, and the famous sort of line that comes out of this chapter is war as a continuation of politics by other means. So he certainly regards, he sees war as being instrumental. It is a means by which a political object is obtained. And and this can be for a trivial end, or it can be for a sort of an existential sort of end. It could be for the survival of your state, or for simply for gaining prestige. So he doesn't really sort of exercise a judgment on that per se, but certainly the way he talks about it, the way he talks about the sort of the nature of sort of the human disposition to violence, and the fact that as he says, like one war will lead to another. He one point talks about how even if you're able to exert your sort of will on the enemy, if you sort of impose your will on him and claim victory over him, that is simply going to be seen as a passing evil. It will lead to another war. It will lead to a sort of another, sort of a spiral. He regards war as kind of this sort of reciprocal play of forces. It's both a question, therefore, of emotion and a question of sort of chance and probabilities. And I think, he regards it as kind of sort of part and parcel of the flawed nature of human beings. But for that reason, he has some interesting views on how war will sort of proceed, because he talks a lot about how, violence, in war, it is escalatory. You try to sort of impose your will on the enemy. The enemy will react. Sort of, the violence will sort of escalate and escalate and escalate. And even if there's a pause, it's just you waiting to sort of see if there's a more advantageous time to strike. But he also says, well, look, this could theoretically lead to an absolute war, but in reality, that's never quite reached. And he's very clear that, it's a combination of sort of, it's essentially down to sort of human flaws and the sort of the nature of reality that, we can never quite reach this absolute state of violence. What we try to do in reality never quite pans out. We can never truly sort of, bring all of our sort of force to bear on the enemy. Bearing in mind, he's writing before ICBMs exist. He's writing before you can before drone warfare, before all of this. So he's very much imagining the very limited nature of military power as you could exercise it in the 19th century. But I think he he very much sees war as kind of like it's something, it reflects human qualities, it reflects human flaws. So and he does talk a lot about, again, I think positive, like what he regards as sort of positive emotion. He talks a lot about courage, for example, and sort of like how courage is so vital to war. He doesn't really talk about other emotions. It doesn't seem sort of, and he at one point he talks about how, oh, well, some philanthropists might think that you can in some way limit the violence of war, but the errors that are derived from benevolence are the worst, he says, because if you sort of allow yourself to be distracted by benevolence in any way possible, then the enemy will inevitably sort of exert more force and therefore sort of overpower you. So he doesn't have much time for sort of, I guess, emotions that you don't associate, that are not sort of usually gendered as non-male, as non-masculine. Like, he's very much, again, I think he does think that war is sort of is full of laudable, sort of brings out laudable qualities in men, because again, it is a very gendered sort of work. He talks about he and sort of him and all this kind of thing throughout. At one point he uses this very evocative sort of wrestling metaphor.
Oh my god, yes.
He talks a lot about wrestling. He likes his wrestling.
He loves wrestling. It's weird. But no, I was going to mention gender, because a lot of how he describes how war functions and the chance and the sort of excitement about war, because I think he does it in a way that I find quite interesting, because he also takes into consideration the enemy and how they're also fighting with everything they've got and all these passions. And while he does regard that war ends with death, that there is actual lives at stake, these are people who will never come home to their families, he does sort of treat it like a game of chess. And I think it's where I wanted to really talk about who this is for, because this type of writing, this style, this sort of allegorical, theoretical approach to what war is, like the very basic element, like the formulaic sense of it, is not something that an average soldier has time for, because they don't have time to think. They're trained to point, shoot, kill, and survive. So I was just thinking when I was listening to, when I was reading this, I was like, okay, who's it for? Obviously, this is going to be for officers, for people of a middle to upper class. But Hannah, you had something on gender.
So I sent it to Henry and I remembered it from like the recesses of my mind. So it's been a while since I've actually read it. But there's a book called Gendering War Talk from 1993. And there's a chapter in it called, from Carol Cohn, who wrote a chapter called Wars, Wimps and Women, Talking Gender and Thinking War. And from what I remember, the thesis of the chapter, and I'll have a look and re-record if it's not, but the thesis of the chapter is talking and doing a kind of discourse analysis on kind of the way men in particular talk about war. And so often men, and Clausewitz does this, obviously, he's writing in the 1800s, it's obviously a very gendered way to talk about war, but often men, especially men in charge, they'll talk about war as if it's a fight between individuals rather than a fight between whole groups of people. And it's spoken about in this almost like masculine boxing match and all this kind of stuff. And she says, okay, this linguistic move, frequently heard in discussions within the security affairs and defense communities, turns a complex state and a set of forces into a singular male opponent. In fact, discussions that purport to be serious explorations of the strategy and tactics of war can have a tone which sounds more like a story of a sporting match, a fist fight, or a personal vendetta. So she's got a few quotes here from other people. Where it was like, I would want to suck him out into the desert as far as I could and then pound him to death. Once we'd taken out his eyes, we did what we could be best described as a Hail Mary play in football. If the adversary decides to embark on a very high roll because he's frightened that something even worse is in the works, does grabbing him by the scruff of the neck and slapping him upside the head, does that make him behave better? Is it plausible that it makes him behave even worse, right? All of these ways, this is talking about war between like huge numbers of people, but they act like it's between two individuals. So when He does it anyway when he's talking about, he uses I a lot, like and talking about it as two individuals. But the wrestling thing was very interesting to me. Like, oh, it's war is a duel, it's a wrestling match, almost as if it's between two people, and it's it's very interesting. And just to like add on that, I guess, to kind of keep us on the schedule, because I'm adding things in as we go. But when he's also talking about the strength of his will, whose will is being discussed, right? Is it the will of the nation, a will of an individual, the will of individual military commanders? Like, who is being discussed in this kind of moment? So yeah, both of you.
No, I think it's a really interesting point because again he uses loads of metaphors in this study. I mean, he compares war initially to I think the dueling metaphor comes first. He says war is a duel, then as you say it's a wrestling match. He refers to it as a game, as a sort of as a play of probabilities, but then also a gamble. And then he refers to it finally as a chameleon because he talks about how war is different in each epoch. But yeah, it's one of those ways in which it's used to sort of abstract, the nature of the subject. And even though he sort of makes clear from the outset, look, war is about violence. You can't contain it, you can't avoid it. A war will necessarily be violent. He doesn't quite sort of, I think, grapple with the fact that by sort of abstracting it in this way, you do inadvertently sort of sanitize it, and you do sort of like lead away from sort of questions of, for example, atrocities. I mean, he talks about the idea that the behavior of sort of burning people's villages down, murdering women and children, that's the behavior of savages, whereas we wouldn't do that. And it's like, well, you just fought a war in which that actually happened, by your armies, by many armies, and it would happen again on a much grander scale. So in terms of sort of atrocities, again, he sort of treats that as being kind of like, well, that's sort of an exception where the sort of the intelligence restraints have sort of lapsed and the passions have come forward, but it's not really sort of engaged with in a more detailed way than that. Yeah, no, I think it's sort of when he talks about the strength of the will as well. Yeah, I think it's kind of, for him, it's sort of it's a combination of this sort of the idea of the will of the commander, like the commander in chief. So he's probably thinking there somebody like Napoleon, who embodies like both the head of state and the commander in chief and sort of the nation as well. Like, he's kind of, he's all of these things. But I think you could equally say that, from his own experience, he could say, well, it's not just about the strength of the will of one statesman who's also a soldier. It's also about the strength of the will of the entire nation, because again, he very much sees the people and the sort of the nation as being kind of a source of sort of strength and a source of kind of energy. I mean, he talks about this, as one of the reasons why you can't exercise your will fully on an enemy country is because the people will always restrain you. The land and the nature and the human topography will always restrain you in some fashion. So yeah, I think again, it's sort of, there are sort of subtle plays that he's making that sort of like, reveal, this isn't just about abstract philosophical conclusions, or if it is, it's done with a deliberate sort of sleight of hand effect to sort of elide war's sort of true cost.
With how it was written, and this is where I'm gonna, because I think we agree on both and everything you said, but where I'm gonna build up is, I think On War is written in the way that men who have served at war want to think of themselves in war. So it's about fulfilling the ideal of what it means to be a soldier, what it means to be a military man, rather than the reality is that you are killing people. So instead, it's using that romantic notion of, sort of, like that, like great expectations thing, like you are force of nature, you are part of this like zeitgeist movement force, rather than you being part of a large collective that is, maybe participating in a genocide. So it is trying to cement this idea, and it's sort of, and this is maybe a little bit too psychoanalytic, but it seems like he's also dealing with his own role in war throughout all of this, and it's coming out as this, philosophical text, and this is where I find On War to be, I think, an issue that an issue that is gonna just forever be a part of military and war studies, because it is a piece of romanticism. It is selling this beauty of what is essentially the most savage thing you could possibly do, and he's trying to sell it as like a gentleman's journey.
Yes, I mean, I think you can sort of see it leaching through as well in places. I mean, at the final sort of page of this chapter, he talks about how as well as being a chameleon, he says it's a wonderful or a wondrous trinity of where he talks about it as being the wondrous interplay of sort of the passions, the chance and reason, and he says all of these things are come together in this quite wonderful way. And you can see how he has this sort of boyish enthusiasm for his subject. This is a man who is sort of like spent sort of 15 or so years studying intensely something around 150 wars, I think, maybe even more. Like he's obsessive about this, but again, as you say, it's really it reflects how he would like to see war, and not necessarily its intimate realities. I mean, it reminds me kind of the FM 324, the sort of the counterinsurgency manual that was produced for during the sectarian insurgency in Iraq against British American occupation. And this sort of field manual essentially had like all of this kind of weird like business sort of analogies. There was lots of talk about stakeholders and maximizing outputs and this kind of thing. So like war language, it's always like kind of a reflection of sort of the zeitgeist. And I think again, Clausewitz sort of like is bringing out the nation here, and the sort of the tension between the nation and the sort of the ordered gentlemanly idea of war and this kind of thing. So I think he's right to sort of point out that war is chameleon-like in its qualities, but I don't think he's quite like realized that that's also true of him and his description of war itself.
Yeah, because I like that the previous season we did Freud, and we talked about the death drive and PTSD, and nowhere is this found. You're supposed to go to war and you're going to be happy about it. But it's also sort of looking it through the eyes of the victor. But you want to talk about duality of war, there's also a loser.
No, absolutely, yes. And again, he sort of abstracted himself from this, but again, you can sort of see how this is fundamentally a book that is meant to guide the sort of the rational sort of soldiers and statesmen of the age. I mean, one of the things when he talks about war as being a continuation of politics by other means, arguably what he means by politics is quite a narrow conception. He's talking about this in an age of sort of where politics, it's called politics, it's sort of diplomacy, it's not really about politics as we understand it today, sort of the organization and sort of distribution of wealth and means and infrastructure and this kind of thing. It's not really what he thinks of politics as being. He considers war to be is still a servant of the leading sort of statesmen, who have the best interests or should have the best interests of the state at heart. He doesn't necessarily think about it in terms of sort of, of class or of gender or anything like that. That said, Marxists have an awful lot to say about Karl von Clausewitz. He's read quite extensively, but I mean, Engels quite likes him because Engels is a military history fanboy. He loves that stuff. He writes loads of like sort of journalism about war, but he's really sort of taken on by Lenin. Lenin, when he's in exile in Switzerland, gets a copy of Clausewitz from the Bern Public Library and sort of goes to town. And Lenin likes it because he says because in the Marxist sort of in his sort of conception of revolution, war is instrumental. War and violence are instruments to achieve a political end, and he regards the revolution, the worldwide revolution, as being kind of a series of sort of European civil wars that will sort of start in in Russia and spread around the world to bring about this political end. And Lenin sort of as a result sort of applauds Clausewitz and says war is our sort of should be our instrument. War can be used in a rational sort of instrumental fashion to defend the revolution, which makes it an interesting contrast with fascism. fascism, because of course fascism sees war as an end in itself. Fascism sees war as kind of like the natural state of being. War is naturally fulfilling, and sort of brings out only the best qualities. Whereas the Marxists were very clear that, like, no, that war is ultimately kind of, it is a means to an end. And this is actually where sort of I first came into contact with Clausewitz, really, more recently in my research, was looking at, for example, anti-fascists in Spain during the Spanish Civil War, because for them, they are beginning to come to terms with the fact that because they have been sort of, attacked by the Spanish military, which has been supported by Italy and Germany, they're having to wage a war against, sort of fascist powers. So they have to come to terms with the fact that their political ends, along that road lies making war to defend what they see as civilization. I mean, coming back to this sort of point about civilized values versus sort of savagery, anti-fascists conceive of, or at least in the 1930s, they very much conceive of fascism as a kind of barbarism, as something that is sort of almost like beneath the behavior of Europeans. So anti-fascism is conceived of as being civilized, and therefore anti-fascist war is sort of, it's in accordance with sort of Clausewitzian practice. So they do cite Clausewitz in a lot of sort of these anti-fascist newspapers. A lot of Republican soldiers during the Spanish Civil War cite Clausewitz approvingly for what he can sort of teach them about, the correct use of war and the innate sort of like violence to achieve a given end. He is attractive to a surprisingly wide range of audiences. So it's not just a question of soldiers in the Cold War, US soldiers or anything like that. It's there's a whole range of ways in which Clausewitz has been sort of interpreted to support very often violent, like, sort of political projects.
Yeah, I was thinking of the proto-fascists, like the futurists, and I would not be shocked if they were, reading Clausewitz, especially within the art movement of the futurists. There was this like fetishization of war itself, where they were trying to use art, specifically like horses, machinery, and all this stuff as an acceleration towards that militaristic end. And I feel like we're talking about like all these like quite theoretical concepts. And like I wanted to ask like Hannah, how are you dealing with all of this? Because this is sort of our bread and butter. And now you're having to be in our realm.
I am not an expert in war studies at all, but I keep thinking about the contemporary as a kind of sociologist, right? Like thinking about how it's still being used. I added a note on the thing. So there's this notion of civilized war, or like you were saying, right? Like war, not doing certain things in war because it's seen as savagery or like seen as not acceptable or not an intelligent part of war, or whatever he keeps saying is a kind of European way of doing war, right? But I keep thinking, is this notion, so a question I originally posed was like, is this notion of civilized war still seen in the contemporary? And I remember when we were talking just before this, we were like, oh, I'm not sure, I don't know. But then I've got a real niche thing. It's not niche, it was like very, like everyone was talking about it, but niche in the way I'm using it, I guess. So you have when it was Trump and Vance met with Zelensky to essentially publicly embarrass him on live TV, there was like an element of the civilized used in this kind of respectability politics, right? Because you have this like, you're not wearing a suit, why are you speaking out of turn, why are you doing X, Y, and Z? And so this notion of what is a civilized way of doing war is still used, but it's used in like really... yeah, it's used in odd ways. I'm interested to kind of hear what both of you have to say about this, right?
Hannah, I think you hit the nail on the head. There is still this sort of discussion about civility. And especially when you think about, like, even let's move beyond that, but let's go into civilian casualty. And, since Obama years, we've been doing drone strikes. And it's... how is this part of civilized war? Especially, the United States is now a world power where, the US may have been the new world during Clausewitz time, but now it's a global superpower. And there are rules to war. We have rules to war now because of World War II, because of the US.
I just had another thing to add. When we're thinking about drone strikes as well, this might be going too far, but this notion of civility only really counts, I guess, if people are involved, if human beings are involved. And if you start to take the human being out of war, or you're removing humans from, like, you're detaching them. I remember this was a conversation like years and years ago around, like, if you're doing drone strikes, it's almost like, I hate to say it, it's almost like playing a video game, right? Like, you're almost like, there's a detachment between what you're doing. You're not actually, it's not like hitting somebody with a hammer. Why is that the first thing I think of, right?
I was going to say, I think that's where I don't always encourage people to go to like a military museum, but sometimes it is interesting to go to a military museum and actually see contemporary uniforms, because there is this element of, yes, with the advancement of technology, you can now set things from far away, from very far away. It's no longer you have to be within a certain proximity. You can do a nuclear strike from another country. There are dolphins with like stuff on their back. This is not a secret. Like it's been said by the US. It's not a conspiracy. However, if you go into a military museum and you see contemporary soldier uniforms, you'll see that there's still a dagger. And that's because no matter how far removed you are, at some point, there is still the fear that you have to do hand-to-hand combat. So yes, I agree. But also there is that fear and element. And I think that is where that type of civility doesn't really exist in war, is where I kind of stand. There is no such thing as civility, because at some point you are still killing and taking a life. That is your job. Whether you are in command, where you're just telling people to do it, or you're the one pulling the trigger or pressing the button. Where do you stand, Henry?
Well, yeah, I think it's something that Clausewitz is a little fuzzy on, insofar as he says we should make no mistakes through benevolence. We should not restrain violence through any humanitarian or philanthropic sort of desire. And he specifically says that, international law is not a thing. It's not a real. I mean, obviously, in a sense, it wasn't a real thing in the early 19th century. But again, he sort of makes it clear that, like, international law has no purpose in restraining the kinds of violence that should be used. His line about what is, civilized versus what is not is kind of fuzzy, and it seems to be kind of where, it's sort of really, it's just sort of, I've drawn it around Europe. I've decided that's where that's going to be. And I think when it comes to drone warfare, and when it comes to sort of the ever sort of more advanced forms of technology, I mean, I think it's interesting because at the end of the day, sort of a lot of these machines still require a human element. And one of the interesting sort of elements of the debate around drones was the person who's driving them. Often, I might have got this entirely wrong. It's been years since I've studied this, but as I recall, there was they sort of, when they were running tests, they found that they were more likely to make aggressive decisions when they were in close contact with ground troops, because they had this sense of, oh, those guys on the ground are depending on me. I need to sort of like, bomb the hell out of this thing that is I discover later is a wedding party or what have you. So it's kind of, there is always, within this sort of, and here I think perhaps there is an element of truth in what Clausewitz is saying, is this sort of this technology gives us the illusion that, we are not dealing with the passions, but the reality is that, we are still using and sort of manipulating these forms of technology in accordance with those. I mean, even the use of artificial intelligence, for example, I mean, when it comes to the recent war in Gaza, the use of AI in sort of targeting technology, which repeatedly sort of designated civilians and civilian areas as being, A-OK targets. It's sort of, we've built in sort of elements of sort of the irrational elements of the non kind of objective into these this high sort of military technology. So I think yeah, to that extent it is still there. It's behind this sort of veneer of kind of civilizedness and sort of high technology and commitments to sort of humanitarian intervention, for example. There is still this sort of this passionate uncertainty in war.
Yeah, and I think with our escalation onto contemporary technologies and stuff, we sort of did forget to answer one part, which was, who was Clausewitz writing this for? So, like you mentioned when you were introducing him, this was originally an unfinished piece. More like he didn't really finish editing, as far as we know, these pieces, and we will discuss this later. But I think one of the big questions, I remember turning to you, Henry, and saying, okay, but who's the target audience for this? And how was it meant to be consumed? Because I was thinking, where is this going to be published if he had published it in his lifetime? Who was going to consume this? Was this going to be placed in military academies? Was this for the learned soldier? Was this for the retired soldier? And you were basically like, yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an odd one because again, we don't really know because he never finished it. But I think to me it reads because so much of this book is again very abstract, very sort of philosophical about war, and I think he intended this partially to the sort of the thinking, discerning sort of soldier that was increasingly sort of emerging. I mean, one of the factors that we see coming forward in the 19th century is the need for staff officers, for sort of men to kind of like process the sort of the bureaucratic demands of war. So rather than just having men running to like Napoleon or Alexander and giving them a message, they have to have like a much like bigger staff of people to do that, and that gets bigger and bigger and bigger as the century goes on. And I think Clausewitz is sort of again writing to this sort of this much more sort of expansive view of who's going to be partaking in war. At one point, he talks about the idea that a soldier must also be a statesman, because the soldier must understand the sort of the society that is supporting him and the means at his disposal. So everything that he does is also political. It also has a political element. So I think it was to a sort of a military political audience, really. I think he did imagine this as being kind of written for the sort of the minister, or for the general, for the army officer. And again, I think it is interesting to ponder, like, what would have happened if people hadn't picked it up. The person who popularized this was Helmut von Moltke, who was the sort of the mastermind of Prussia's victory over France, and he sort of said, well, one of my big influences is Carl von Clausewitz, this book on war, and that sort of helps to really popularize it and sort of like send it into sort of overdrive. But again, like, what would have happened had this not been the case? It's and it finds very different audiences in the 20th century as well, because here you have for the first time the kind of let's say the academizing of military affairs. You have sort of academics, strategic studies departments sort of opening up, talking quite extensively about sort of matters of defense and security and this kind of thing. Henry Kissinger being the most cursed example of that sort of individual, which actually that could lead us on to the translation question, if we're sort of going for that. I mean, because again, Clausewitz gets translated into English in the 19th century, but there's quite a long period before it gets translated again, which I think he gets translated in the 40s in an edition that's sort of closest to the original German, but doesn't quite flow very well, and it didn't really sort of gain that much traction.
And this is where I had to like remind listeners that are non-German speaking that German changed. So like we said earlier, Germany didn't really exist. There was like Austrian German, there was Prussian German. Germany existed in different types of states. So like within any other sort of setting, there are dialects, there are different ways to approach language, and Clausewitz, obviously being a von, more than likely used very high German, but this is very kind of antiquated German, so it is quite difficult to read. I did not even attempt. I knew better. And so you're also translating from that type of German. So whoever's doing the translation has to be very well read, and usually they would have to be a fluent native German speaker to translate this, because it is complicated in English. I bet it's more complicated in German.
Yes, no, and it's I'm glad you brought that up, because the translators, it's Michael Howard and Peter Parrott, and I think Parrott was possibly some kind of Germanic extraction. I'm not sure, but either way, he was stationed in the US, and Michael Howard was a sort of military historian based in the UK, And these two men are responsible for the most widely circulated English language sort of translation of On War, which they published in the 70s. And they, again, coming back to the question of who is this written for, they translated this for distribution to essentially to soldiers. They said we need to simplify the language, we need to target it, at the kind of the thinking soldier, the sort of the West Point, the Naval Academy, that sort of person. And if you compare the texts, in a sense, theirs is a lot easier to read. But they take a lot of shortcuts as a result. And Hugh Strachan has written quite extensively on this recently. He said, well, and Hugh Strachan, not a native German speaker as far as I know, but he, speaks German well enough to take a look at the original. And he said, it's not quite what he said, and actually he sort of picked through it and he said, well, actually, what Howard and Parrott did when they wrote On War was they really amped up the part where he talks about war as a continuation of politics by other means. They essentially said, look, what Clausewitz wants is for politicians to sort of limit the destruction and violence of war. And part of the sort of the driver there was that this is the Cold War. They fundamentally believe that, this is sort of the final stage, I think, of Vietnam. They sort of see, sort of war run amok in these events. They say, well, no, we need to bring war back under the control of policy. We need to sort of limit it. We need to sort of impose rules onto it. And actually, if you look at, I was looking at the Graham translation. I didn't really get that impression reading it, and Strachan sort of agrees. It's sort of this. It's very much this sort of he is very focused on war as violence. He doesn't see war as something that should be particularly restrained by anything. He doesn't really see it as sort of something that needs to be entirely even subordinate to politicians, just to a political object. So it's an interesting one because as with the Marxists sort of taking him and sort of and saying, oh, look, this is justification for doing, world revolution. So too did sort of liberals during the Cold War take Clausewitz, translate him and give him a new sort of spin. So every generation gets a new Clausewitz. They get a new version of this guy, and actually sort of getting at the original meaning is quite challenging.
Yeah, I really can't wait for the Gen Alpha Clausewitz. But no, I think, because even just the similar elements are there, like the dueling, it's all there, but there is a different sensation. And I can feel the simplification of it because it's not very long. It's very dense, but it's not very long. And I can also see this as, giving it to a soldier as like a work exercise to talk about okay, how does this philosophy work within actual application? So this is why when we first chose this, I was like, is this a handbook? Like, what is this being used for? And having it be translated and then be used and applied is a really interesting thing to me. Because now we're dealing with the learned soldier. For better or for worse, they have an education. It goes into, I think, where I kind of also want to finish up. So I want to continue talking about translation, but maybe ease into what we now define as absolute war. Because I feel like with this translation, we kind of have the big atomic question post World War II, which is, have we reached it? And how does translation now deal with this? How did you think, Hannah? Because you were dealing with uncharted waters.
Yeah, I did also. So let me read it. I forget what I sent to Henry. I sent to Henry yesterday and I turned around to Paula and I also said it about so I said random question that would take us on a tangent, so feel free to ignore. But does the threat of nuclear war change both the notion of disarmament? Because Clausewitz says one of the aims of warfare is to disarm your opponent, and I know disarmament is a whole thing around nuclear war, nuclear history, but also is that even possible now, which I don't think it necessarily is. And the relevancy of kind of Clausewitz today, also when we're thinking of absolute war, like World War One and World War Two obviously affects the way we understand war completely, like completely changed the way we understand war. And so in the contemporary and post World War One, World War Two, like what is the relevancy, I guess, of Clausewitz?
It's a really good question because Clausewitz, it gets sort of after World War One, it gets absolutely sort of hammered by a lot of academics who sort of, especially Basil Littlehart, who's one of Britain's sort of leading military theorists, essentially says, well, Clausewitz just wanted to, sort of conduct like maneuver warfare, which is, which will lead to disaster in sort of, in the age of the machine gun. So he basically said Clausewitz, not relevant. Sorry, bye. And then the nuclear age comes along, and sort of military theorists sort of look at, again, Howard and Parrott both sort of like see Clausewitz and they say, well, look, Clausewitz clearly wants us to limit the use of force because, if we did let this sort of go to the absolute like extreme of nuclear exchange, that would be disastrous, and but. But again, Clausewitz never imagined, like, Clausewitz is very clear that, like, absolute war doesn't exist in reality. You can never get it. It's sort of, it's reality will always sort of, will always sort of get in the way. But I think there's the other question of sort of like, if war is about sort of achieving a political end, what political end is achieved through a nuclear exchange? And this was something that sort of a lot of statesmen privately came to the same conclusion on, was that, actually in the nuclear age, there's not a great deal of relevance to sort of, all of this sort of Clausewitzian thinking, because Clausewitz is thinking about a scenario where war is not only sort of possible, but almost inevitable because of play of passions, etc., etc. Whereas in the nuclear age, war itself would mean the end of sort of all political ends would be impossible.
Total annihilation.
Total annihilation, exactly.
In regards to so we've basically been going into we've been beating Clausewitz up with a bat. But I kind of wanted to end with a very basic question, which is, where does Clausewitz fall, especially with the division between war and military studies? Because we're both war historians, and while we deal with military history, we're not exactly there. And I feel like Clausewitz is a very military history type of book, or on war is.
Yeah, I mean, it's an odd one, I think, because he essentially says, he talks about military history as being, this great book, this sort of big store of teachings, but he's very clear that he imagines theory as, he said, I don't want, theory to be something that has to be reinvented constantly. I want this to be sort of a means by which we can understand, sort of this great book without having to start again from first principles every time. So his whole point was to sort of go down to sort of, what are the philosophical fundamentals of this thing that we call war? What is war at its root? And as a result, sort of he says, war changes. War's nature may be constant, but war's character is constantly changing. And I think to that extent, I think he's a little more thoughtful than, sort of your average military historian per se, I think. Well, no, okay, I'm about to make enemies of quite a lot of people, some of whom might eventually be colleagues. But I think if we think in terms of sort of the vision of a lot of military history, it's often very contextually specific, and this is actually true of history in general. We burrow into the sort of the context, the specific context that we're looking at. And oftentimes that means we don't see the bigger picture, and we don't end up incorporating the bigger picture. And I think Clausewitz was sort of wary of doing this, and he was wary of sort of talking, with too much specificity in a way that would make his book useless in the future. So I think in that respect, he does have lessons for not just for military historians, but for historians in general about the importance of theory. It's not just a matter of sort of, oh, this isn't true in every scenario. Well, it's it's not meant to be. It's a way of guiding your thought, and it's a way of sort of helping you sort of through the tangled landscape of human activity. So yeah, in that respect, I've defended Clausewitz very slightly, I think, but
we gave him a crutch.
Yeah.
Yeah, and war and military history are two different things for the people that don't know anything about it. It's very specific. We do not have enough time here to go into it, but that's kind of why I wanted to end. and sort of go into media connections, because I know Henry's. I don't think you know mine yet. And, Hannah, I know it's a video game. So, Hannah, if you want to start us off.
I wanted to, Henry, you probably heard this. So I wanted to show Paula a video.
It's always great grandpa in 1945.
Literally. So my media connection is the Fallout games series, specifically the first game, because I think the first game really kicks off this whole thing. I've just shown Paolo and Henry the video that basically a version of this plays at the beginning of every single Fallout game. But the quote that they use every single time is that war never changes. And I forget where the quote comes from. There's loads of different places and loads of different sources that people use. But the first game is published in 1997. And that line is usually voiced by Ron Perlman, apart from, I think, Fallout 4. They didn't use his voice. I don't know why. I don't know what happened. But the original video, which I didn't show you, I don't think, discusses kind of historical wars that connect to a kind of fictional post-war environment. And this statement of war never changes is the idea kind of similar to Clausewitz, which is why I kind of thought of it. I don't agree with it, but it's the idea that no matter how different all of these conflicts may seem, they ultimately still happen because of humanity's fundamental flaws. Conflict is part of human nature. And so the game is a role-playing game. So you wake up in this kind of mid-22nd century post-apocalyptic and retro-futurist world. This is decades after a global nuclear war led by the United States and China take place. There's loads of theories within the game of who actually started this nuclear war. I like the theory that the US started it. But the war follows a kind of global conflict caused by resource shortages that devastated the world and destroyed modern civilization. But the game is really interesting because it has, again, it's this role-playing game. So you're walking around, you're talking to people, you're not just fighting and shooting and all this kind of stuff. You're doing that as well, and fighting radioactive monsters. It's a whole thing. But at the kind of heart of each of these games is people. It's people are at the heart of it, factions. You usually have to choose, especially Fallout 4 is the one I'm most familiar with. You choose a faction to go with and change the kind of future. But it's this idea that people will always be at conflict. There's always going to be factions, all of this kind of stuff. But that was my media connection. I thought it was interesting. And also we've kind of unpacked this notion that war never changes. It obviously does and has. And it's interesting they use nuclear war to be it never changes. I'm sorry, I've just destroyed every video game person's perception of Fallout. But there's a podcast if you're interested in more called the Fallout Lorecast. It's great, fantastic. Anyway, yeah, that's my one.
Also, if I'm right in thinking, there's a lot of war in the sort of post-nuclear war landscape. The New California Republic has this big army with these really cool uniforms. And it's sort of again, after this nuclear exchange, we're just going to reset and do wars all over again. Why not? And it's a thesis. I'm not entirely sure. Well, maybe that's sort of how you do post-apocalyptic drama, isn't it? You have to have everybody fighting each other for resources.
Yeah, and Henry, what was your media connection? I know which one.
Okay. So, obviously, I would have made it Gerard Butler, Law-Abiding Citizen, where he talks about Clausewitz, but he only talks about him for one half sentence. So I thought, actually, instead, I can go one better, and there's a scene in the film Crimson Tide, and Crimson Tide it's a bit of a novel. It's also set in the 1990s, I think.
Yes.
It's set on a nuclear submarine. Some Russian rebel sort of faction has seized control of nuclear weapons and is threatening nuclear war. And there's this nuclear submarine, and Gene Hackman is this
SS Alabama.
The SS Alabama, exactly, yes. And basically, Gene Hackman is this sort of gruff, like Patton-esque sort of naval officer who, sort of does everything sort of, by the book, and he's very sort of focused on getting the job done. And he's given a new executive officer played by Denzel Washington, and Denzel Washington's character is the sort of the new thinking soldier of the sort of the new age. There's a bit at the beginning where Hackman is reading his CV and he pauses and he looks up at him and he goes, "And a spell at Harvard," and just immediately starts like judging him based on his education. And the premise of the film is, at the time they still had, if I'm not mistaken, early 90s, the nuclear submarines had the authorization to launch a preemptive strike if they were given the order. So essentially the premise is the XO, played by Denzel, disagrees with Hackman about whether or not they're going to launch the nuke, and they have to, there's a mutiny and then there's a counter mutiny and all this kind of stuff. But before this happens, when the tension is sort of building, they're in the officers' mess, and they're all sort of sitting around talking about imminent nuclear war. And and Hackman is probing Denzel's character, sort of talking about so what do you think, should we have dropped the bomb on Hiroshima? And and Denzel sort of is kind of being very cautious with his language, and then Hackman says, he says, "Oh, I'm a simple man, I'm a simple soldier," and then he sort of pauses and he says, "War is a continuation of politics by the means, von Clausewitz. So what do you think about that, Denzel?" And then Denzel sort of says, sure, yeah, I think it is, a continuation of, or was a continuation of politics by the means. But I think in the nuclear age, the real enemy can't be destroyed. And Hackman says, "So who's the real enemy?" And he says, "Well, in my opinion, in the nuclear age, the real enemy is war itself." And it's a really interesting one, because it's actually, I think, when I saw it the first time, I thought, oh no, he must be misunderstanding Clausewitz. I mean, I can't, because this is a script that was partially written by Quentin Tarantino, so I was convinced that this had to be wrong. So when I go back and read it, I'm like, actually, he's not wrong. I think there is a sort of the reason it's an interesting scene is that it does touch on the sort of the question that we were alluding to earlier about, in an age where sort of more or less total destruction is possible, does it make sense to think of nuclear war as a means to anything? Like, truly, can it achieve anything at all? Yeah. It's also a good film. It's got some standout appearances by James Gandolfini and Viggo Mortensen, and a dog. A Jack Russell plays a... So, I don't know if they're allowed to have Jack Russells on a nuclear submarine, but they had one.
It added. I'm going to ask Henry you a wild guess as to what I have decided to choose for my media connection.
Is it the masterpiece of naval filmography, Master and Commander?
It was originally.
What?
I changed it. If you remember, I was between two.
Oh, okay. I'm not sure I remember the other one then. This is...
So you're gonna hate me. My media connection is Battlestar Galactica.
Oh, for heaven's
TV production masterpiece. Hannah, have you ever heard of Battlestar Galactica? For those of you who don't know, I'm reading it off the Wikipedia because I taught 2 classes today. Battlestar Galactica is set in a distant star system where civilizations of humans live in like a group of planets known as the 12 colonies of Kobol. In the past, the colonies had a war with their own android race creation known as Cylons. So basically, the show starts with the Cylons now have made themselves to look like humans, and they basically like blew up all these planets, and now there's like this survival colony going into space trying to colonize this theoretical religious prophecy of this planet called Earth. And Henry and I have been watching Battlestar Galactica. I've already seen it, but I haven't seen it since I was in high school. Henry's seeing it for the first time, and I don't know. I think Battlestar Galactica deals with the issues of absolute war. They can't go Clausewitz because it doesn't fit into their distant planet thing. But there is an episode where the military tries to like overthrow the government, and it's, I don't know. I think it's pretty Clausewitz, if I do say so myself. All right. With that, I think we should end. We're melting.
I'm also like, yeah, this is a sweltering room because I have to, like, there's screaming children constantly outside because we're near a school. So I've had to close all of the windows and,
No, enjoy the
expiring.
breeze.
Yeah. Okay. Should we all say bye together? Bye. Henry, you look so confused there. Thank you so much for listening to Theoryish. We really appreciate it and would love to hear your thoughts. Check out our Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, and Twitter at Theoryish_pod for up-to-date information. And please rate, follow, and leave a review wherever you're listening to the podcast.
If you're interested in finding anything we have mentioned in the episode, please check our show notes or description to find more details. You can also contact us at theoryishpodcast@gmail.com.
See you next time.
Goodbye.